Greetings, this is Chapter 2 of Video 2. Let's launch. All right, so the learning objectives we're going to have in this video series are going to be to evaluate the weights in various tax law sources, and then we're going to describe the legislative process as it pertains to taxation. So tax law sources, there's basically going to be two overall arching authorities. They're going to have the primary authorities and they're going to have secondary authorities. Actually, before I begin going on this, I want to start off by saying something here. I told you in the past, in the previous video, that when we talked about audits, one of the things that I have to say about that is I felt that this is where we have a lot of value with our clients. Now, let me tell you something. If you get into tax to do work in the field of tax, research and legal understanding law sources is going to make you very, very popular, because there's a lot of people who don't get it. They don't understand it. There are a lot of these people who do a monkey see, monkey do. All that they're doing is, oh, okay, well, I build a partnership tax return using these methods. And this is the same method that we used last year, and that person used the year before that and used the year before that. And so there's a lot of people who put a whole lot of thought into how we do these sorts of things. It's kind of, somebody kind of learns on the job in order to be able to do a lot of this stuff. Now, hopefully we're going to cover a lot of the stuff that we need to in this class, and you're going to learn a lot about different methods. And of course, when we have our office hours, I'm also going to have some opportunities where I'm going to teach you guys some of the tools and the tricks in the trade so that you actually can do better things with in terms of actually tax compliance would work. Now, that said, this tax law sources, I will tell you, when I first started at my first job in the tax area, one of the things that I had kind of going for me was I was able to do tax research at a manager's level when I was still a staff. That was what the partner had told me. He said he thought it was extremely valuable, and he recommended that I continue to do it because it made me successful in his firm. And I think that that's something you need to understand. Understand how these legal systems work, how these law sources work. If you get this and you're able to do tax research, think about it this way. If I have a manager and I'm charging them out at $275 an hour, and I got a staff and I'm charging them out $105 an hour, and I can have the staff do the same level of work that the manager does, guess who's going to get the tax research? And then, by the way, guess what's going to happen? You're going to get promoted faster. And so it's actually a good thing. I noticed that was happening with me because I wasn't afraid to go to the books. I wasn't afraid to go find the answer. And I think that was a feedback from my military training, because if I was trying to understand aerodynamics, if I was trying to understand the jet propulsion theory about some of the stuff that we were doing, or some of the turboprop theory, I'd go back to the books and research it. And that's what the military taught me to do. I applied it into the tax world, and all of a sudden I became very popular amongst a lot of the partners as a result of that, because I could find answers that others couldn't find. So again, getting back to this, primary sources of authority, you're going to have statutory sources, which is basically, they say your Internal Revenue Code. That's basically laws that are passed by Congress or by the state legislature. Then you also have judicial sources, which is the courts. And then you have administrative sources, which is IRS pronouncements. Now, in reality, what normally happens is Congress passes a law, a tax law, and then what ends up happening is it goes into the system and people apply for it for a while and they use it for a while. And then all of a sudden, the IRS gets taken to court over some of the stuff that they do. So it doesn't really, in my personal opinion, it doesn't really become settled until the judicial sources take a look at it and say, this is what Congress meant. This is how it was. Now, I understand all you guys who are really big constitutionalists out there, you kind of go, well, that's not how it's supposed to be. I get it, but I'm telling you reality. I don't tell you what I want. It's like poker. I don't play the cards I want. I play the cards I have. Okay, so what you need to understand is I think judicial sources are very, very target-rich, fertile ground for finding good sources for why we do certain things that we do in the administrative field. And something that I do have over here, I do have, actually I don't have it here. It's in my office because I was working on a tax return for a client. I have a depreciation guide that basically will say these kinds of improvements classify as these kinds of under depreciation rules. And the reason why it happened is because of court cases. So that's actually very useful. And then there's administrative sources. You're going to have your regulations. You're going to have your rev rulings, rev procs. IRS manuals, things of that nature. Then you have secondary authorities, which are unofficial tax authorities. Tax services and tax articles are going to be good. I have here, hold on. I have here a copy of the Tax Advisor. I know this is what I read on Friday nights when I go home and I have nothing else better to do with my life. I go home and I read taxes. I know most of y'all now want to find out if I need to have a lobotomy or something of that nature. But no, I'm getting better at my stuff by reading these guides when I go home. They produce a lot of tax articles. They can be really good authorities. You can say, hey, look, Tax Advisor talked about this. Now, I probably wouldn't want to use this in court, but it might be a good source. But the good thing about these is that these secondary sources are going to cite the primary sources in order to justify their position. And so it can be a good place to find primary sources if you're looking for something using topical research. And so that can actually be very useful. And then there's tax services. Checkpoint's a very big one. BNA's another big one. I use Checkpoint. Checkpoint's my favorite. When we do tax research for the research project, I will probably help you with Checkpoint because that's actually very important. And these are going to be sorts of primary tax authorities, just some common ones. They're going to talk like IRC, code section, blah, blah, blah. And you'll notice that when you get to the firms, some of your partners, especially at a lot of the bigger firms, we tend to call these people code heads. And basically what a code head is a guy who walks around and says, well, according to code section 168K, we can take bonus depreciation on these, and they can cite the code section. You're going to have some people who prepare tax returns that have no idea what the law says. They just know that that's the way they've done tax returns over and over and over. I would actually argue that those people are probably not the ones you want to be referring to when it comes to why you're being able to do this. I think the code heads is the better way to go. But again, you also want to listen to what your seniors say so that you can actually kind of figure that out. Okay. And then you've got some like the committee reports. Committee reports can be really useful because what they'll do is they'll put out what the committee discussed, why it discussed the way that it is. Probably more useful if you're going to be taking your client or your clients are going to court and you want to understand why was a law passed the way that it was. Because if you understand why a law was passed the way it was, you can argue it before a judge with a straight face and be able to get done with that. And then, the Ways and Means Committee. Ways and Means Committee is the committee where tax policy gets developed in the House of Representatives, which of course is the first body that a tax law has to be done with, as the textbook talks about. These are some other primary some primary tax authorities. I'll let you read those as you see fit. The book goes over it, and it's very good. The big difference, revenue. I would say the big difference. So, like final regulations. In order for a regulation to get done, it usually takes about 18 to 24 months because there's got to be a lot of legal loopholes, and it says who can actually release the authority and things of that nature. Revenue rulings do something similar to regulations. They usually take a topical situation and they say, look, in this situation, this is how the IRS would rule on this. And that can actually be very useful. Revenue rulings don't take nearly as long to get released. And so that's why the IRS tends to like these if they need to get something out as fast as possible in order to kind of do this. Now, if they need to go real fast, they'll just do a tax notice, or they can also do a TAM, which they'll talk about later on. Judicial authority, obviously, Supreme Court of the land is the law. Supreme Court is the Supreme Court of the land, and they will we've talked about that in previous videos. But when you're looking at the citations, that's what they look like, and so you can tell which court it comes from. Tax courts, you have memorandum tax court decisions. Memorandum tax court decisions are the ones where they're kind of like the S cases. They're actually it's a court case, and I think that's the case. The one where you can't rely on it because what ends up happening, and they'll release them. And the reason why these things get released, not necessarily because the tax court wants to release them. It's because of what they call the FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act, where basically these tax services go out to they go to the tax courts and they say, we want freedom of information release on these tax cases that we know you've gone through because that's public record. They'll know that the case has gone through, but they won't know the actual meat of the cases, but they do the FOIA request, they can actually get that. And then here's your U.S. District Court, which of course is important. Secondary tax authorities, like I said, research services, BNA, CCH, RA. I forgot about CCH. I don't use them. I found them to be a little wonky. I don't want to pick on them, but I like RA because to me, Checkpoint, which is RA, tends to be, it's very Google-like. So I kind of like it. There's other people that use BNA. They're good with it. My personal opinion is that it's kind of like Doritos and Cheetos. There's some people who love Cheetos. There's some people who love Doritos. I'm more of a Doritos man myself, mostly because I like nacho cheese, but that's neither here nor there. So newsletters, daily tax report, federal tax weekly alert. These are things that kind of come out. You can subscribe to them, particularly if you have access to some of these other tax research services. Law reviews. And then you have professional journals. Like I said, Tax Advisor right there at the bottom. Shouldn't be at the bottom, should be at the top of that list because it's what you should be trying to get to as soon as you can. If you get into tax, it is going to be the best investment that you make is signing up so that you can receive the Tax Advisor at home. You can also have quick reference sources. Again, that would be... so like right here, if you take a look in the background here, these are master tax guides. That's what the master tax guide looks like. This is the 2008 depreciation. This is the depreciation guide. I know it's really thick. How can they make something so blooming thick for something that's supposed to be so pretty easy? And then this is the master tax guide, however, for 2019. So it's actually a pretty big thing. This is really good because if you want to look up a tax topic, you can find it. It's paper. Some people still like paper. My personal opinion, this kills trees. I probably wouldn't recommend it. You can do electronic. I get these for free though. This one was given to me by Edward Jones. I also get one from Paychecks every now and then, and that's all very good stuff in order to be able to get that. Textbooks. Okay, let me tell you about textbooks. And look, I don't mean to be picking on textbooks. That's not the thing. But if you walk into a client meeting, you pull out a textbook, you are basically telling the client you don't know what you're talking about. The textbook is very good. I think it's a good reference in order for you to have at your desk. So if you're trying to remember, oh God, I got startup expenses. I can't remember how startup expenses go. You can go to your textbook and you can look up startup expenses and kind of get the gist of what's going on. Now, do I recommend buying a new textbook every year? No, that would be ludicrous. Doesn't hurt to have one. I used to actually get one about every 5 years. I would just go to the local university and just buy one of their textbooks. It actually ended up working out pretty well so that I could keep up with various things. And sometimes when I ran into something that I couldn't remember, but I knew it was covered in my tax class, maybe it's something I don't cover that often, you can actually do this and figure that out. Now, Google's gotten better, but I wouldn't recommend using Google. That's like going to Google and self-diagnosing yourself with a disease. It's a bad idea, and it's bad for you to be successful. So, are these primary or secondary sources? IRC is obviously a primary source. Tax article in USA Today. My personal opinion is take a lot of the articles that's written in popular periodicals like, USA Today, New York Times, Washington Post, all those guys. I'd take some of it with a grain of salt. I've seen where there's been a lot of articles that get written that there's a lot of misinformation in there. Want to be careful about that, but go ahead and use it, but just make sure that you do your homework ahead of time because USA Today is not going to cite Internal Revenue codes very often. Article on Supreme Court opinion, obviously, is a secondary source. Supreme Court opinion itself is primary, though. RA Federal Tax Coordinator is a great article that I use that quite frequently in my own office. And then, of course, Treasury regulations are going to be a primary source. So statutory authorities, U.S. Constitution, contrary to popular belief, not high. They say it's highest law of the land. However, a tax treaty can override certain aspects of it. And so what ends up happening is that if you have a tax treaty that gets passed, that tax treaty can't override what Congress has done. And the reason why that kind of works out is that they've kind of settled this in the courts where they basically said, look, they went ahead and they signed this treaty. They've agreed that they're going to go ahead and do this. And so that's kind of a way that's ended up happening in the past. So if you're dealing with treaties, first of all, this is international. This is something I deal with on a daily, or not daily basis, but practically weekly basis where I deal with tax treaties, finding answers for people and all that sort of stuff. So you want to make sure that you're well-versed and you might want to know how tax treaties work, but I don't necessarily think you need to do them on a day-to-day basis. Probably not going to be a big factor, but Constitution, like I said, 16th Amendment provides Constitution to tax income directly. Yeah, actually, if you want to do some yucks and giggles, go ahead and download the tax form that was in 1866. I'm sorry, 1863 or 1864. They actually have the tax form. It's really cool to kind of look at. It's one page. You can fill the whole thing out in one page, and it's kind of neat to look at. Statutory authority, Internal Revenue Code, main authority of Congress, changes enacted by Congress. We've already talked about that. This is how they get done. So you'll have like subtitle A, chapter, and the way that it kind of looks at. So if you say Code Section 162 is going to basically be like, for example, where it says section one, it says section 61, 62, 63. So there's going to be certain parts to it. And sometimes you'll hear different references to things. Subpart F is a type of income that takes place. And that actually happens above, obviously, under subchapter, then part, then subpart. Subpart F is actually an international tax regime. And so, we have to know that when we do the international side. Then you have subchapter A, subchapter B, C, D, and all that sort of stuff. And they talk about various areas. Chapter 1, of course, being income taxes. And then, of course, you have subtitle A, which is, of course, income taxes. There's actually a really good Wikipedia article. I don't normally reference Wikipedia for important things, but just for yucks and giggles and Jeopardy knowledge, I always say that it's a good idea to kind of look at it and see that sort of thing. This is the legislation process. It's too small. I'll pass on it. Judicial sources, again, Supreme Court, highest law, judicial authority, same level as the Internal Revenue Code. I would actually say that it settles a lot of stuff that sometimes the IRC doesn't always get really solid on. That the Supreme Court will interject where it needs to be. Courts of Appeal, we've talked about that in a previous class. I won't get into it. Yeah, district courts, tax courts, all that stuff. We've talked about that in previous classes. Previous videos. Administrative sources, so you got the regulations, 3 different forms: final, temporary, and proposed. So what'll happen is a final has gone through the entire process, is released, and is what it is. They're not changing it anytime soon, unless they decide to override something because they realize they screwed something up. Doesn't happen very often, though. I mean, it's very, very rare. I've not, if you asked me to cite one that had been changed, I couldn't even do it. Or at least that had been superseded or something of that nature. I don't know off the top of my head. It doesn't happen very often. Temporary is basically where the IRS thinks they want to do something a certain way, and they're not 100% sure, so they're going to put out kind of a temporary regulation and say, hey, for now, this is what how we're gonna kind of treat this. Maybe they're still kind of chewing on it, and they don't know how they want this to kind of flow out. And so what'll end up happening is they'll say, this is how we're going to do, temporarily while we get this. And then proposed is, hey, we've come up with an idea. This is what we're thinking about doing, but it's open for public comment. You're allowed to use that in order to complete your tax returns if you want to, because it is a proposed one. But just be careful, like over a couple year period, proposed generally will turn into final or might be dropped altogether. There are some long-lived proposed ones. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head just because they're not things that we deal with very often. But there are some regulations that do stay in the proposed period for a long, long time because they just don't finish them. 3 different purposes, of course, interpretive, procedural, and legislative. I'm not going to get too much into that. Rev rulings, like I said, less authoritative weight, but they carry as much more detailed interpretation of the code. They're actually written in English, which is something I really like. I really tend to get my people to actually look at because of that. And then you have revenue procedures. Sometimes we call these rev procs. Basically, what they do is they explain in great detail practice of law. Very good example. I wanted to do a PLR for a client, so we actually prepared a PLR, sent it off to the IRS for them to do it. That's a private letter ruling. That's the third one that they're talking about. But how do you do a PLR? That's a big question. I didn't know the answer initially, and so I had to go ahead and download, 2017-1 that actually talked about the rev proc procedures in order to do a private letter ruling. So that was actually kind of important in that sense. So we want to make sure that we follow those procedures because we actually, when we submitted ours, we had forgotten to do one minor thing, and they came back to us and said, you got to finish this one part. And then we said, okay, here it is. And they, sorry about that. And so put it in our brain box so that we could use that later on. Letter rulings, less authoritative, but more specific than revenue rulings. Again, now private letter rulings. Generally speaking, well, actually not generally speaking, they are. They're applied to a specific taxpayer. So if I get a PLR for my client, you can't use that same PLR for your client. Just can't do. So what ends up happening is that you have to request a private letter ruling. Now you might say, well, why the hell would I want to read these things? Well, let me explain to you why you would want to read the private letter rulings. It gets you into the IRS's thought process. And if you're looking at something and say you've got this thing, it's not very clear. You can't find a regulation that goes with it. You can't find anything else that'll actually describe what you're trying to get done with all of this. But you read the letter ruling, guess what ends up happening? You look at it and you're like, holy smokes, I get what the IRS is trying to accomplish here. And then the cool thing about the letter rulings is they're going to cite the citations for you in order to get to their thought process. So if you go ahead and you file yours in the same way using their letter ruling format, you should be good to go. All right, folks, so that's all I got to say about this video. I want to say thank you very much for coming to class. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.